Hello, and welcome back for another Creators.Chat. Today we're going to talk about inspiration, which is everyone's favorite subject, I guess? I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
It's great to be inspired, and it really sucks to not feel inspired. And I feel like it's a problem that a lot of people run into, and everyone, it's probably one of the most common questions any of us get online is, how do you get inspired? Where do you find your inspiration? Yeah. And it's a huge thing. Some people hate inspiration and just think you should just grind out work all the time, and other people think maybe you should take a break sometime. So yeah, we're going to talk all about what inspiration is, how we find it, how we think it's a good thing, potential pitfalls, how you might be able to screw yourself over trying to find inspiration. And yeah, it should be just kind of a fun thing to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you want to start us with like what inspiration is?
Yeah, sure. That's always a good place to start, isn't it? I feel like, a lot of us do have different ideas of what inspiration precisely is. I think that it's kind of a state in which obstacles are not stopping you. You feel excited about your work. You feel capable of doing your work. I think that inspiration is very closely related to flow states. It's basically when your work feels like something you want to do and can do. And, that's a really good place to be creatively, because the opposite of that is very, very difficult.
Yes.
Do you have any additions you want to make to that?
No, that feels about right. It's a great thing, and as you said, the flow state thing is very relevant because sometimes you're working on a piece and in the middle of it, maybe you'll start it uninspired, but as you get into your work, you'll suddenly hit this flow, and everything will kind of sync up, and then you'll feel that inspiration. So sometimes you'll find it in the midst of working. It doesn't always have to be, the trigger for working. Sometimes it can come along, and then as you're working.
Yeah, I guess it's almost like a guiding light when it happens, right? I think sometimes when we're creating, we don't feel particularly inspired, even if you're just sitting in the middle of the spectrum. So it's not like you're completely uninspired, but you're also not like super inspired either. You can kind of feel a bit lost, not sure what to do next, not super confident in what you're doing. And so having inspiration feels a lot like a sudden direction, like an absolute clear beacon, like this is what we're doing, and you're like, there's not enough time in the day to get it done. So yeah, it's a really great feeling.
So I'm curious, we didn't talk about this before. What percentage would you say of your time spent making art do you actually feel inspired?
Not high.
Yeah.
I would say maybe 10 to 20%, like in an inspired state, in like a this is great state.
I was going to say 20%, I feel like that's realistic, and that's even probably a little optimistic, being that we do this all the time. This is our day job. This is our life. And even then, despite putting all the time and effort possible into it, about 20% of the time do we feel like, this is great. And that's doing well, I think. I don't think it's realistic to expect like 60, 80% inspiration levels where you're just, it's daily bliss, working. I don't think that's realistic. I think that's just an important thing to set right off the bat, that people hear about this. They hear about like, oh, wow, they must be super inspired all the time. Realistically, no, most artists are not super inspired. A lot of art is just this, it sounds dull to say, but a grind. Like there are a lot of times it's work, and that's okay. I hate when people think that it should or needs to be this passionate inspiration to get anything done, and that you're a bad artist if you're not inspired.
That's got to be one of the most common points of shame, I think, for artists as well, is this feeling that other artists are inspired more than I am. I am not a real artist because I don't feel that compulsion the way that other artists do. I get stressed, I get bored, I get frustrated, I get distracted. So yeah, that's a very good point. It was a very good thing to raise. It's like a very, very important thing to realize and have like a good, healthy expectation of. So yeah. Do you
want to talk about where to find?
Let's start. I kind of want to, before we get too into like where to find it, I want to start a bit higher level than that. I like to kind of work in like theories first, and then you understand why the ideas work. So I like to think of this kind of balance between creation and consumption. So creation is obviously it's what we're doing. It's when you're inspired and you're making things, and it's like you are putting work into things. It's like you are spending energy, spending resources and inspiration in order to create. And then on the opposite side of the balance is consumption. It is where you are not creating, you are taking in. So we're thinking like things like, watching a movie is consumption. And it's something that a lot of artists feel really guilty about doing. It feels not only passive, but kind of negative, because, creation is where we're giving and doing and putting out and spending. And then consumption is where we're absorbing. And I think that a lot of the time we are not giving ourselves enough consumption. We are putting so much pressure on ourselves to create, we're not consuming. So I think that for a start, a lot of inspiration comes from replenishing that energy, that creative energy. And, so that's where one of the first things people will say, like, how would you get inspired? You're looking at, inspiring artwork. It's a form of consumption.
Sure.
So a lot of the things we'll be talking about, see if you can kind of spot that recurring pattern if it's something that you're taking in. So yeah, would you like to kick it off with any additions before we kick off?
No, that sounds great.
Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, should we talk about?
Yeah, let's talk about various, I guess, the forms of consumption that we tend to like. I mean, art, as you said, is a really good one. Just looking at art, browsing art, is a great source of inspiration. Not only current artists, to see what people are up to, see what your favorite artists are making on a daily basis, but also browsing, books and museums for all the old masters and all that stuff. That can be a wonderful source of inspiration. And, anytime that I'm feeling bogged down or like stuck or don't really know what to do, flipping through a few art books is usually enough to kind of get me started, because it's enough to be like, oh wow, I wouldn't think of painting something like that or in that way, or that subject matter. And that's kind of a cool thing. It's cool to see the world through these other artist eyes, and it's a powerful source of inspiration. I love it.
Yeah, it's got to be it's probably one of the most direct ways to get inspired, because it's like a complete obvious translation over to what we're doing. It's like, I'm trying to do this painting, I don't feel inspired. Here's the kind of painting I want to do, now I feel inspired. So that one's always a good one. We will touch base on that one later though, because it is rife with problems, drama. Don't say we don't entertain you. Anyway, speaking of entertainment, like I said, movies, media. So this is very similar. As artists, we're creating, and obviously things like movies, things like TV shows, they are a type of creation. And so they might not directly apply to what we're looking at, but like they can inspire us in like visually, they can give us story inspiration, they can even just in a lateral way, I'm like, oh man, I want to make something big like that. And it makes me feel like this is why I do stuff, is so I can make something that has an impact like this. So media is a good one.
Movies are probably one of my favorites, because they usually don't inspire me directly, because I mean, I don't tend to work in film, I don't make storyboards, I don't do that stuff. It's more that they do such a wonderful job of telling stories and conveying mood, and they're such powerful tools for doing that and just affecting somebody, and I just love them. So when I think about like what inspires my own personal work, it's usually kind of a collection of movies and the kind of feelings that I had while watching those. So I love watching movies.
Yeah, I feel the same way about music actually. I didn't think of this one until you said that, but music will often inspire me. I will go on a binge of all my different like inspiration resources and feel nothing, but then sometimes just in a moment of frustration I put on music and I'm like, yeah, okay, I feel that now. This is like, so yeah, any kind of, I don't know, anything that makes you feel, that is like a huge source of inspiration.
Sure.
So yeah, maybe some less obvious ones are things like socializing. I know that there are a lot of introverts out there, a lot of introverts in the art community, but honestly, being around people can be a huge way to get inspired. That connection with other people, the reminder of why what you're doing is important. Like, you can either collaborate with other artists or just, connect with people you love. That can be really restorative, even for those of us who aren't as social. It's, yeah, I think probably one of the most overlooked sources of inspiration personally.
Yeah, I think even like speaking as a fairly good introvert, that even still people can be a huge source of inspiration and connecting with people, like even on a one-on-one basis. That's kind of like introverts, like holy grail right there is like, you know, deep connection with somebody one-on-one. And it's a great way to kind of get out of your own head and connect with somebody and see things from another perspective.
For sure.
And that is just, it's a phenomenal way to get inspired. I mean, we have each other, which is super nice.
Yeah.
So we talk about art and our projects and all that kind of stuff all day long. And it's really nice to get outside of our own heads and be able to bounce things off of someone else, because they're going to come at it from a whole different perspective and probably won't be bogged down with all the stuff that we're thinking of, like, oh, I can't do it because of this, and this problem is going to come up. They're like, oh yeah, that seems like a great idea. You could totally do that.
And, we considered this.
And then it's like, oh wow, yeah. So if you are, you know, finding yourself struggled or stuck or anything like that, I find talking it over with somebody that you trust is just really incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a certain kind of realness that comes from speaking with people. I know people say that you're not supposed to receive external validation and stuff. I have complex feelings on that. I think that's an oversimplification, but I digress. Topic for another day. You know, a lot of the work that we make is powerful because how it affects people. Like, we don't create art in a vacuum. We make art to be seen, to be like understood and felt by people. And simply being with people, even like honestly, if you're not showing them your work, but just being with people reminds us of that connection, reminds us of the effect that we want to have. And that can be really, really grounding. So yeah, people can be inspiring.
They can.
Yeah. Also travel.
Yeah.
Travel's a really good one.
One of our favorite ones.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I'm sure lots of you are kind of already familiar with this one. It's a very popular way to get inspired. Just that exposure to new stuff, of course. I also think that just the sensory input, sounding a little bit woo-woo, but soaking up the energy. I find, especially as I've got older, I identify as being an extrovert, but I'm finding nowadays that's less of a social thing and more of just like a energy thing, being stimulated thing. Like I like being in cities, not because I want to necessarily like meet all the people, but I love walking where all the people are and just kind of being around the ambience and seeing what the vibe is like what's going on, seeing that other people are doing and feeling things. That can be really inspiring. I just walk around it and I'm like, don't do anything. And I get home and I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. So it's a little bit of a tangent, but obviously, just travel presents so many new opportunities to like broaden horizons and learn.
I'm going to do the opposite of you and say that I love travel, obviously, and getting inspired, but my direction would be more the nature route, where there is no people.
Yeah, that's true.
Where you go off and there's no people around, and it's great. It's just you and nature. And whether that's, you know, hiking or camping or whatever it happens to be, just driving through a cool place with beautiful nature. That is one of my favorite ways to get inspired. There's nothing better than like a full day of hiking to get me anxious to make stuff.
Yeah.
Because there's something also nice about hiking, that you're walking all day and there's not a whole lot to usually do.
Yeah.
You're usually there and you're aware of everything and you're having a good time, you're experiencing it, but you got a lot of mental energy for thinking. And I find that it's just a great way for me to process all of the thoughts and, you know, feelings and stuff, and often come up with a lot of really great ideas. Some of my best thinking seems to happen when I'm out walking, out hiking. And so it's a great way to get inspired.
Yeah, it makes me think of actually walking meditation. I have struggled with meditation a lot. It does not come easy to me. And I have found that walking is a great way for me to meditate. There's something about the physicality of it, I guess, takes me outside of my head and puts me more in my body. It makes that kind of rumination and excess thinking just like quiet way down. So that's another part of the travel is just like physically being places and doing things. It's like really, really valuable.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Does that cover every? I mean, not every.
One more.
Oh yeah.
Just as it came to mind, learning. Not necessarily about the subject that you want to be inspired on, but just laterally. It's amazing the kind of weird ways that you can connect things up, just like seemingly completely unrelated sources, and that might solve a problem or just like make you think of something in a different way. I love doing that. Like when the reason I do my newsletter with the weekly world building prompts.
Which you should sign up for, because it's really good. I get it for free, so I'm I'm feeling good about this.
It's one of my favorite ways to get inspired is to just go and research something cool, because it's kind of like building the visual library, but more knowledge based. It's amazing what you can learn, both like just facts, but also patterns, and just, I don't know, it's really cool.
I think that's why I like audiobooks so much, is that I've constantly got an audiobook going while I'm painting, and it's just a great way to constantly be getting new influences into your brain all the time. It's wonderful.
It can be a really nice way to get inspired, and but while taking a break from your work, because obviously if you're exhausted and like running yourself into the ground and like working really hard at art, and you're not feeling inspired, and you're just trying desperately to get inspired by like reading art books and going to museums and just doing all the things you know how to do with art, you're going to get so burnt out. Doing something like this, like learning something else, can be a really nice way to continue to be productive, but just take a goddamn break from art. So that can be a really nice one.
Love it.
So that's probably it for there's obviously going to be a million ways and very individual ways of getting inspired, but that's kind of a good overview, I think. So then I think the next thing I want to talk about, another higher level concept, is thinking of inspiration as, so we've done creation, consumption, being a balance. I think of inspiration as being on a spectrum, one end of the spectrum with art block, basically. If inspiration is like the higher end, like everything is great, art block is the same scale but at 0. And I find that a lot of the time a lack of inspiration is actually more the presence of art block, or like vice versa. Actually, personally, when I talk about ways to get inspired, I think my favorite way to get inspired is to bust whatever's causing me to not be inspired. So there's a lot of useful stuff there that we can do. It's not just like something to be miserable about. There's usually something there that we can address. So art block is a big topic. This is another one we get asked a lot about. For every how do you get inspired question, there's a how do you overcome art block question. And I'm fascinated by it, because I think that it is a very logical thing with a very kind of enigmatic result. It can feel so hard to dissect and understand what's going on. It's so complicated, and there's so many factors. But I do think that so much of it's extremely logical, and if we can get really aware, we can start figuring this stuff out and use it to our advantage. I'm gonna pause a sec. I have something in my eye. Anyway, so we're talking about the different ways in which different factors can stop you from feeling inspired. So one of the classic ways that this can come up is stress, basically. I think that in some ways inspiration is like an absence of negative factors. It happens when our work is facilitated, when there's nothing getting in the way. And so when we're incredibly stressed out, it can be really, really hard to feel creative. I personally don't think I ever feel inspired when I'm stressed. And on that same spectrum is things like, being overwhelmed, being burnt out, struggling with mental health. All of those things are really, really difficult. And I think that a lot of the time it's somewhat easier to address those things rather than plow through, to take a step back and say, what do I need to do here to alleviate my state of mind? That can be really powerful.
I will say that probably isn't true for everyone, because honestly for me, a lot of the times, not all the time, when I'm feeling stressed and anxious and there's a lot on my plate and I'm bogged down, sometimes art is actually the relief from all of that. And sometimes I actually find a lot of inspiration in those times, because art is almost like this little escape that I can do from all this exterior stress and problems and stuff like that.
That sounds a lot like inspiration though to me. It sounds like you are inspired when you do that.
Well, that's the thing, is that Yes, I am. But that's kind of the point, is that yes, like all this stuff is going on and it's definitely not great. And it would be very easy to not do art. But sometimes if I do kind of trick myself into making a little bit of art, I can almost kind of be inspired by the fact that this is not a stressful experience. I mean, sometimes art is definitely stressful, but it's not all the other stuff I'm dealing with in life. And so sometimes there's actually a lot of, fulfillment to be found in making art, even when stuff is just falling apart.
Lucky you. I don't know that. I feel like when I am stressed out, I can't. Like there's just
there's plenty of times I don't, but I'm just saying that there are exceptions to the rule.
It's very true. And I will say that I think that there's a point in between those two where people have like a knee-jerk reaction to, I'm stressed out, I should stop working, I should take a break.
Right.
Because I find that when I am stressed and overwhelmed, a lot of the time it's because I have a lot on.
Right.
And taking a break compounds that. It doesn't actually fix things. I'm like, if I could just stop for a minute and say, like, what do I have on my plate? What can I tick off quickly? How can I make this easier for myself? Like, what resources do I need to make this go away? That can be a great way to address things. Like I used to be in kind of an unhealthy cycle with things where I would be struggling with a painting and I would feel stressed and overwhelmed and burnt out. So I would say that means I need to take a break and consume some media, and I play video games and I would feel worse, and it would just keep going. And I'm like, I'm taking breaks. Why am I still stressed? I'm like, I'm still stressed because the stimulus that was causing the stress is still there. In fact, it's just getting worse.
Sure.
So a lot of the time, there is a nuance to saying like, okay, I do need a break, and breaks are really important. And I think that they should be something that's built into our like day to day. I think that they're absolutely vital, but it's not always the answer. Sometimes it's because we're kind of losing focus, we're doing the wrong stuff, we're grinding for no good reason, and being like, okay, what can I do to make like the most impactful difference right now? How can I wind this back and be like, refocus my efforts? So there's a lot of nuance to that one, I think.
Sure.
To like, stress. On the other end of things, boredom and lack of challenge can be a really, really uninspiring thing. That's part of the whole flow states thing, is trying to get that right level of challenge. Obviously, if we're trying to do work that's way too difficult for us, it's pretty uninspiring. Same is true as if like it's too easy for us. If it's a job we've done to death, if it's the only type of work we've been doing for a long time, if it's something we can do in our sleep, that feels really uninspiring, and we end up just kind of grinding.
I feel like I've read some study at some point, I'm really scientific here, that I think the failure rate you're supposed to have for peak learning is somewhere like 10 to 20%, where 10 to 20% of your time you should be doing something that you don't feel like you're succeeding at, that you do feel like, oh God, I don't know what I'm doing. And that the rest of the time you should mostly be doing stuff that you do feel like, all right, I can do this. Like this is a level of challenge that is, doable for me. Because I feel like if you're at 90% failure and you're just terrible at everything you do, I don't think it's like a great way to learn. But same goes for like 2%. If you're failing 2% of the time, like you're basically just repeating yourself forever, and you're never growing, you're never learning, because that learning is an uncomfortable process.
I think that growth is a huge part of what drives us creatively. We are always looking to expand, to grow, explore, and if we're not doing anything that's particularly challenging, we don't get that. I think it's actually very closely related to purpose, and that one's a huge topic. I actually did a course with Justin Donaldson, which I'll drop a link in the description. It's self-guided at this point, but we'll do future runs. And it's all about exploring that purpose, like why we're creating. And purpose is like, if we're not being challenged, our purpose is really, it comes into question. We're like, why am I doing this? Like, what am I contributing? Like, I could do this with my eyes closed. I'm stagnating. And that's a really awful feeling.
Oh, it's terrible. Like the times I felt the least inspired and the most blocked in my art has been the times where I have stagnated in my skills. I'm not learning, I'm not growing, where I'm grinding out freelance work for other people that isn't inspiring. It's not fulfilling. It's just a job. And art just turns into this daily grind of a job. And guess what? It doesn't take too long of that before you're just burned out and uninspired. And I feel like if you leave art block long enough, you're just going to feel burned out. And I think that's just like an awful thing to come back from. And I've definitely felt it a few times, at least coming on. And the thing for me that usually got me out of those times of feeling really down was starting to find things that were fulfilling to me, whether that's getting back to studies and learning, because learning is a big part of what I like about art, and also just doing personal work in general, just doing paintings for myself. Because at the end of the day, most of us are doing art because we like making art. Like we're not doing art purely for other people. Like a lot of people like working for other people. A lot of people work client jobs and they love it because there's something super cool about working as part of a team and making this really big project and collaborating with other people, and it's great. But I think at the end of the day, most of us, at least at some point, really like making art for ourselves because we like making cool pictures and sharing them with people.
Exactly.
And I think making sure that you remember that and get back to that from time to time, even if you do have to, do freelance jobs all the time. I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's very true. And it can also apply in the opposite way that you were just describing. I felt that way more actually from getting stuck in study purgatory. I never really did too many freelance jobs. I tried to avoid that as much as possible. So I never really experienced that boredom and lack of challenge and like lack of purpose in freelance work. But I have felt it in just kind of forever studying. It's something that I will often accidentally wander into. I feel like all of us are kind of drawn one way or the other. I think we're either like happy comfort zone painters who just want to do the thing all day long, or we're just like, I just could learn all the things. And they both have their pros and cons. But I'm definitely one of those who just like will naturally drift towards doing more studies and learning. Anytime I face a challenge in my work, I'm like, I could solve that with a study. And then I start, building up the study until all I'm doing is studying. And that's really good and everything. It's very beneficial for my skills. I start questioning why I'm doing any of this. I'm like, it just becomes a grind. It's all about how good I am, how good I'm not, and I'm not applying it to anything. And that's always a really good way for me to get reconnected to my purpose, is to take a step back and be like, why am I doing this? It's always to do with story for me. I love anything story related. And there's not much story in studies. So I have to every now and then bring that back and say, like, how can I apply this to telling stories with my art? So yeah, that lack of challenge is a really big one. Let's see, what else have we got here? Unsolvable problems. This is one that I think a lot of us come up against. We don't fully realize what it is. It's when we get frustrated with a painting and we start blaming ourselves. We're like, I must be just a terrible artist. I bet other people could figure this out really quickly. It's often that it's just a bunch of problems we're not solving. And so I say unsolvable problems. I mean unsolved. So just, breaking it down into parts and saying, like, why am I struggling with this? Like, what objectively is wrong? Looking for the resources we need. Problem solving. Like,
I feel like for both of us, there are often times when one of us will get stuck in a painting, and say you're stuck in a painting and you've been grinding at it for hours and you just feel like you're stuck and you're not going anywhere. And usually I'll come over and realize that all that stuff you've been working on is fine. It looks great. It's just you haven't painted this thing over here and it looks terrible and it's just throwing off all the rest of the stuff you're doing. So there is something about like figuring out what things you're just unconsciously just avoiding in your piece and actually solving those problems. It's something I do all the time, is that I will just like not paint a subject in there for so long and realize that if I just sat there for 20 minutes and just figured it out, I could just fix the problem. And suddenly it wouldn't be a problem and the painting would be cohesive and whole and all that. And I think it's just something we all run into.
I think so. I think so. Another thing we all struggle with is expectations. The expectations placed on us either by ourselves or by other people can be a huge inspiration killer.
Yes.
Gosh, and this will kind of move on to, we'll get into this later, but there's nothing more defeating than being like, I'm not good enough, I'm not doing this right, and you know, looking at other people's art is like a great way of doing that. But yeah, I think having expectations either like of what our career should look like, or how much money we should be earning, or how many followers we should have, or like whether my family approves, all that kind of stuff. Expectation is heavy.
I think the hardest way to make a great painting is to expect yourself to make a great painting.
Oh gosh, yes.
Like that is a surefire way for me to screw up, is be like, sit down and be like, all right, I'm going to do the best painting I've ever done. And then it inevitably turns out terribly.
Yes.
Because you have all this pressure just crunching down on you, and you're like, well, I have to make it incredible. Like pretty good is just not good enough. So it has to be, and it just turns out terribly.
Yeah.
And the same goes for anything else. Like if you only can be happy, only be satisfied if something is absolutely perfect, it's either never going to happen or it's just going to turn out like a train wreck.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare like you expect something perfect and it turns out perfect. It just realistically doesn't happen.
Yes.
You can shoot for doing something really well and putting in the time and trying hard. There's nothing wrong with that. But expecting these like insane expectations is just, it's unrealistic.
I actually did a video on that. I think it was input versus output.
Ooh, yeah.
So go check that out.
That's right.
Yeah.
Good memory.
Thank you. I'm proud of myself. We're being all professional and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that leaves us quite neatly to move on to the next subject. And, you know, expectation is a big part of this. And it's ways that we think we're going to get inspired that actually aren't inspiring. And I think I'll preface this by saying that there are ways of turning these things into inspiration, but they're tricky. Sometimes we do things to get inspired and end up feeling worse.
Yes.
Kicking that off, and you know, I've been referencing this several times so far, is looking at other people's work. Minefield, not always the best thing you can do.
No, it can go terribly wrong. In fact, there's a lot of times I suggest people look at less art than they are. A lot of people should be looking at way less art than they do. Because looking at art all the time it brings on all kinds of unrealistic expectations and jealousy problems and all sorts of other things that you just don't need to deal with. You could probably do with looking at a little bit less art, for most people. It's definitely something I see happen a ton, is people look at all this art and they set these super crazy expectations for themselves, and they sit down to work and they inevitably screw up. And this is something, again, it happens all the time, is, you'll look at all this art, you'll be super inspired, you'll see these beautiful paintings, and you'll be so pumped to sit down and paint. And then you sit down and paint, and you realize that painting is still just painting, and you are still just you. And your skills haven't magically gotten better. You're not magically going to produce work in another style. You're still just you, and art, turns out, is still slow and uncomfortable and hard, and it doesn't go smoothly. And that's just how art is. And so sometimes we go from this super high of looking at art and imagining just how great art could be. We could, crank out these 60-hour paintings every day somehow, and in all sorts of styles, and we're perfect and everything's great. And then you get to actual painting and you just crash down, because that's what painting's actually like. It's hard.
That's true.
And
I think we tend to massively overvalue things that we can't do and undervalue things that we can. And looking at art is really, really difficult for that, because, there are just infinite ways you could tackle a subject, like absolutely infinite. And every time we look at someone else's work, it's a way that we wouldn't have done it. And so we instantly value that really highly. I think this is because we know what went into learning what we know, making what we make. So we there's no mystery about that. We're like, well, I just did this. That's obvious. But for people who can do things we can't do, we're like, oh my God, how did they do that? Like, I can't do that. I want to do that. And it's just this kind of mystical thing. And so we look at other people's art, and they've done a bunch of stuff that we would never have thought to do. And we feel completely useless. I'm like, oh man, I never would have thought to use that. I wouldn't have done that. And that can be really defeating. It's something I've had to really learn with my art, is that I'm looking at other people's art and saying, gosh, that's amazing. And there's something wrong with me because I never would have done that. There's a lot of stuff in my art that only I would do. And that's really hard for me to realize sometimes. Yes. And I'm like, that is its own thing, and I'm not seeing it objectively.
I'm going to show you this video the next time you feel that way. So like, see, this lady said this. You should listen to her.
So much easier to tell other people how they should behave than to behave that way myself. Anyways. So yeah, I do think that there are ways to look at artwork, and like just in a more careful way. And I think honestly, having a reason for looking at the work. So I only really go on inspiration binges when I'm looking for something in particular. I'm like, sure. I want to see how artists handle this particular subject, how they do this kind of brushstroke, whatever. Yeah. And I will go looking for that thing. I won't just be, just letting it all wash over me and just overwhelmed with stuff I could be doing. So that one helps. Yeah. I think also keeping a very healthy awareness of the kinds of narratives that you're feeding yourself as you're looking at other people's artwork. Just catch yourself in the act of saying things like, oh man, you could never have done that, and they've not been doing this as long as you, and they're better than you, and like all that kind of stuff. Like, just try and nip it in the bud. It's like kind of meditative, isn't it? You can't stop yourself from thinking stuff like that, but you can catch yourself and bring yourself back in, and just not let yourself run rampant with it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of something I'd like to bring up for sort of everything, is that kind of the healthier way to do these forms of consumption is active consumption rather than passive consumption. I feel like it's easy to slip into passive consumption. For instance, watching a TV series. Super easy to just sit down, turn your brain off, enjoy the show. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it is a little bit different than being more active and conscious about your consumption. Really thinking about what you're consuming, and even if that's occasionally just thinking, hey, I really like that, lighting in that scene, or hey, I really like that idea, I should remember that. And actively thinking, how could I incorporate this into my work, into my practice? And I think that can come about in pretty much any type of this consumption that we're talking about. Like if you are looking at art, be conscious and active about how you're consuming that art. And as you said, if you have a specific thing in mind, that's a great way to consume art in a very conscious, active way, rather than just passively scrolling through art, which it's fine. Like I do it sometimes, but I think it is a little bit different. So for instance, one of the things that I did is, I got fairly decent at figure painting in the past couple of years. And something I did was I scrolled through a bunch of art trying to find artists that did figures in a particular way that I really liked, because I wanted to find ways of figure painting that I liked. And you start to discover, I like this painting, don't like this painting. And then you start to use that inspiration to kind of guide your own path. And I think that's a great way to get inspired, is to really actively choose how you're consuming this stuff, so that it's not just mindlessly scrolling and feeling bad about yourself and feeling bad about your lack of work. And every time you're scrolling is like, well, I'm still not making any art. I'm still just looking at art. Yep. So that's just kind of a general thing to think about for all of these things.
I think that applies to pretty much everything that we mentioned in the first section about consumption. And it's actually kind of what I was going to move on to next as well, is I was just going to say about like playing video games. It's a very personal anecdote for me, but I think it can be applied to pretty much any kind of form of consumption. I will often turn to video games, and if I need a break from work, if I'm feeling burnt out, tired, I have worked really hard, I deserve a break, and I will pick up a video game. And I have really struggled to balance my video game usage. I tend to end up kind of numbing with them. And so this is where the problem comes, is rather than playing the game, consuming it, thinking about it, looking elsewhere for other things to do, I just start hitting that video game. It becomes my easy source of dopamine.
Sure.
I'm like, I might take a day off, like one day off, and I'm like, I'm going to play a game today. The next day I'll come downstairs ready to work, and I'm like, that's difficult. I could just play the video game. Mm-hmm. And we end up in this situation where I don't want to solve the problem, I don't want to do the difficult thing. Mm-hmm. It's just so much faster and more rewarding and more stimulating to just play the video game. And consumption runs at risk. Pretty much all types of consumption, we run the risk of over-consuming. And I mean, that's kind of what you were saying, is like there is a type of active consumption that is controlled and mindful and purposeful. And then there's the passive consumption, which is what I often lean onto, which is where I'm just trying not to work, or like not even. It's just, it feels like a better state than not. Like it's so passive, and it's soothing, but it also is compounding. Right. And trying to get out of that, like that stress still exists outside of the game and of any type of thing we're consuming. It doesn't go away, and that's why I use this term numbing. Is it's not actually fixing anything. I'm not refueling. I'm just distracting. I'm just trying to not address the thing I'm not doing. Right. And that's something that I'm still working on. Sure. I'm kind of cold turkey at the moment because I'm like, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Yeah. But yeah, I think just being really mindful of stuff like that, catching yourself in these patterns, see what you're doing where you're like telling yourself that this is a good, healthy thing I'm doing, I deserve this is important, I need a break, whatever it is. And realize if you're actually, you're not taking a break, you're numbing. You're just like using it as a replacement for the thing that you wanted to be doing. Right. There is a difference, there's a difference between taking a break and then doing something like I do. I think all of us are prone to in some way, is like, I want to do the thing, but I'm going to just do this a bit more first. Or like, there's definitely like there's a difference. Oh yeah, and I think there's another way, because a way that I find that I kind of do a similar thing is actually with creating. Yes. One of my favorite ways to procrastinate is to work on other stuff. Yeah. And it's something I find myself doing all the time. And I'll have some project I'm working on that requires brain power and thinking, or maybe I'm trying to finish some really difficult paintings or something like that. And instead of that, it's pretty easy for me to fall back into, well, I could do some figure drawing or some figure studies. And it's easy to slip into these other things. And you see it all the time of people slipping into their comfort zone work, whatever that is, whether it's sketchbook pages or portraits or figures or whatever it happens to be. You see them kind of returning to this like really easy procrastinating work rather than the really difficult, big, hard stuff that they should be doing, that they want to do. Yeah. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with comfort zone work. I love comfort zone work. It's not to say there's anything wrong with doing that kind of work, whether it's sketchbooks, portraits, whatever that is. That stuff is great. Like, I'm glad I do as much figure drawing as I do. It's when you want to do those other things and you find yourself not doing them because you're distracting yourself with this other work. It's the same idea as like any of this stuff. If you want to achieve this, but you find yourself just getting your easy dopamine from some other source, that's when it starts to become a problem. And I think it's important to realize it doesn't have to be just video games. It can even be art. Yeah. It can even be really useful, productive stuff. Absolutely. Gosh, yeah, art is honestly one of the biggest honest time sinks. Like, I'm an artist. I'm supposed to work in the studio. I'm supposed to be painting. It feels productive, but the truth is, when I'm painting, unless I'm really careful, everything in my life falls apart. I'm like, I stop working out, I stop seeing my friends, I stop doing business things, I neglect to take care of my emails, I have like customers requesting support, and I'm like, no, but I'm painting. And I'm like, that's not right. That's like, that needs balance. So yeah, no, you're totally right. Even productive things can be numbing and distraction. So yeah. Let's shuffle on to over-inspiration. Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah. Do you want to start on this one? No, you can kick this one off. Oh, really? Yeah. Really? Yeah. Okay. It's kind of like what I talked about before with like looking at too much art, and you can just feel so inspired and just incredible and super pumped to work.
And I swear this happens like every time we come back from a trip.
God.
Like we'll be gone for, a few weeks and we won't have our computers with us. We won't have like had time to do any art, and we'll finally get back to our tablets, and it's terrible because we just immediately bomb whatever we're working on. It's absolutely terrible. And you remember that you're still you, and that art's still hard and all of that. And that can be really hard. And I think it's just important to realize that and expect it.
Yeah.
Because I think if you do expect it, if you do anticipate that it becomes a little bit easier, because hopefully you'll be able to lower your expectations a little bit.
Yeah.
And that you'll be okay with screwing up your first few drawings, and as you clean off that rust on your skills, that it's okay. That you will be all right. Because I mean, you've definitely experienced this too.
So many times.
Yeah.
I'm terrible at it. Every time I go away, it doesn't even have to be for like a big vacation, or don't even have to go and see like an art gallery or anything. If I just go away for a weekend trip, just that absence from the computer and just something a bit different, and I will come back. Even it might just be something small, like I'm going to completely change my routine with this little like idea I've had.
Sure.
And I will invariably cause problems for myself every time.
Yep.
I've had to get really good, like you say, at just being aware of that and kind of disappointing myself ahead of time. It sounds a lot like being cynical and self-deprecating, but it's just that recognition of this is probably one of those things where my expectations are climbing a little bit high. I have to be really good at saying no. And that's tricky. I sometimes will come home if we've taken a long trip and I've had a bunch of ideas and I'm excited to implement them all. I'll just write a list and I'll just get it out of my head.
Yeah.
And I'll go through that list later and be like, kind of like imagine myself in each of those things, because a lot of the time I get so inspired to do things that are just not me. Like a guilty cello upstairs before I learned this skill, where we came back from a trip and I was like, I need to learn the cello. This is like the thing that I should have done years ago. This is going to change everything. I'm going to learn the cello. It's collecting dust. I maybe tried twice. So, there are a lot of things that we think that we're inspired to do, but we're imagining this glossy, rosy version of ourselves that would never actually do this thing, or it's going to take some serious life adjustment we can't commit to do the thing. We'll look at artwork that we're like, I wish so much that I could do that. I want to do that. Yeah. It might look gorgeous, but it might make us miserable. It's just not how we, how we think of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I have that feeling every time I look at a graphic novel. I'm like, I could totally do graphic novels.
Yes.
I'm not a graphic novel guy. I'm not good at that. But every time I read one, I'm like, ooh, yeah, I could totally do it. That could be my life now. Yeah. I would be the best at that. And so what I've found that I tend to do is, just like you, I write them down. I write down every, random fancy or whim that comes along. And I'm like, yeah, I could totally do that. And then I don't stress about doing everything that I write down, because realistically, there's not enough time in life to do 1% of the things you think of doing or could want to do. It takes a long time to get good at anything, to do any kind of project. So it's pretty few things that you can actually do.
Yeah.
But I think it's good to write them down and, look back through those notes. And sometimes I'll find that I've made the same note like 4 or 5 times, and I'm like, all right, that's at least something to play around with, because it's something that keeps coming up as I want to do. And then maybe, you can find some small way to try that out and see if you actually enjoy the work itself. Because a lot of times we love the end result, but we don't actually love the work. Because I hear it all the time of people like, oh, I wish I could draw. And yeah, everyone wishes they could draw. Yep. Not everyone wants to be an artist. There's a very different thing there. Because honestly, everyone I've met could draw, but you got to put in like 7 years of hard work. Yes. And most people don't want to do that. So realizing the difference between I'm inspired by the end result and I'm inspired enough that I want to do all of the in-between work, I think it's just an important thing to think about.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that we can end up with a very rosy view of what we're going to do. I honestly think that just setting some time aside to try it. And it doesn't have to be long, because honestly, I can come up with a great idea and I'm like, I really need to do this. I'm so excited. I'm so inspired. And I will keep putting it off, thinking that it's totally going to happen. It's totally going to happen. If I actually try it for 5 minutes, I'll often be like, no, this is not comfortable. Like, either it's not as exciting as I thought it would be, or it's just full of challenges I didn't anticipate, or, you know, there's so many things. But you can usually kind of tell in your gut when something is not going to click with you, and just trying it, and like even just for 5 minutes, and, you know, obviously don't buy a cello to try it for 5 minutes. don't be silly like me. But just like things like, I'm going to try and paint in this style, like, set it aside and see if you can give it a go, see what it feels like. And you can pretty quickly tell in your gut when you're getting excited because something really is like going to work for you, or like when you're just getting excited because it's new and exciting. And so yeah, I think that just learning to like get that awareness is really important. So I think the last thing we wanted to talk about now is something that comes up actually surprisingly often, is how to deal with jealousy when you're looking at other people's work. And I think we might have actually gone over this at one point in one of our videos, but I think it bears repeating here. I think that jealousy can be inspiration. I think that jealousy is essentially inspiration gone wrong. It's when we've let it go awry. We've taken a source that could be seen as inspiring, and our own narratives have like tainted it, made it really negative. And it's tricky because it's a natural human response. It is basically a little firework in our head saying that that person has something that I want, is able to do something that I should be able to do. And it's threatening, and it's like a really negative, hostile feeling of like, I want that, and it's not fair that I don't have that. So as with most of the things we're talking about today, I think the first step is just an awareness, just seeing it happening. Because the dangerous thing is that sometimes that can go so unnoticed, it sits underneath the surface. We don't even get time to register it as jealousy before it becomes, I'm a terrible artist, maybe I should give up. So it can be really insidious. So just learning to see when that's coming up and just feeling that's like, I feel jealous, like I want what that person has, and giving it a name. Because I can get very self-righteous and I can be like, I don't think that person's worked at this as long as I've done. Like they figured it out younger than me, it's not fair, I should be able to do that. And it gets kind of like catty, like, why I don't want that. Just kind of calling myself out, catching it and being like, it's not very nice. Like, what are you doing? Do you want to be that person? That can be pretty powerful, just like putting the brakes on and saying like, hang on, you see what you're doing, right? You see that's not very nice. Do you have any?
I mean, I also have in the past especially used that for motivation / fuel to get better, to improve. That's, I think during my early student career days, that was one of the huge things that pushed me to get better, was feelings of jealousy, anger, resentment, fear. All this kind of stuff just really drove me. And I don't think it's necessarily the best. I don't think it's a great way, but it is what got me there. It is a way. And if you're having these feelings, like, I think there's probably ways to turn them into more positive feelings. Like when you feel jealous of someone, realize that that's you feeling something, and that they probably worked hard for what they have, and you probably shouldn't feel jealous. But I will say that I did use it as motivation for myself for quite a long time. And those feelings did push me to get better, because I would see these other people that were doing great work, and I would feel bad that I would look at my work and be like, well, this is terrible. I'm terrible, but I could totally get better, and I'm just going to crush these people. And it's the same idea of like, you get turned down for some competition or some grant or award or whatever, and you just get mad at it, and then you work hard. And so sometimes you can use those negative feelings for positive gains. I don't really think it's that healthy to do. There are much better ways to handle feelings, but when I was a young 20-something and an idiot and hadn't figured out any feelings or emotions or how to process things or no awareness of anything, when you're that clueless, like, you can actually use them for some decent motivation. So
you've done some growing.
Yeah, a little bit.
One thing that I do, it's kind of similar to what you were saying. It's maybe slightly healthier. Maybe I try to imagine the roles reversed. So when I'm looking at someone's work and I'm jealous, and like an important part of jealousy is that we feel we deserve what that person has, because we can look at celebrities without feeling necessarily jealous because they're celebrities. They're like completely unattainable. But we might be really jealous when our like neighbor gets something, like when a colleague gets promoted when you think you should have been promoted and stuff. Right. That's jealousy. There is a difference between looking at what someone has and being like, oh, that's cool, and being like, I should have that.
Right.
And that is the bit that's really tricky and like unhealthy. So when I catch myself feeling that way about another artist's work, when I'm seeing that, like, I'm like, I should be able to do that. It's not fair that they can. Right. I've probably worked at least as hard as they have, and it's not fair that they... Sure. I try to imagine the roles reversed. So, if I were to have a student come to me and say, I love your work so much, it inspires me endlessly, I really hope I can do what you do one day, you must have worked so hard at this, do you have any tips? I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. And it's a great exchange, and they leave like, they leave inspired and everyone's happy. Not so much if that person came up to me and said, how long have you been doing this for? And I say, like 5 years. And they're like, lucky. I've been working at it for 7. And you're like, okay, that's nice. There's something really, I don't know, really lovely about that humbled student. There's something so, I don't know, romantic, I don't know, just really nice about someone who's just an open book, or like who will just like consume information and, not personally tie themselves to things. So just like, they just want to absorb and learn and admire and just like be inspired. That's the kind of person I want to be. Yeah. It's not the person I always am. Underneath the surface, I definitely have every kind of negative thought.
Sure.
But like, I want to be that person that can moderate that and be kind to other artists, feel sympathetic joy for them. That's another whole other thing. But, seeing that person is an artist like you, and they are crushing it. They are doing so well, and it's a nice thing. It's a great thing. It's so good that there are artists doing that. Sure. It gives us hope that we might be one of those artists one day. Yeah. And it's just all good things for the community. I just want the best for other artists. Right. So just trying to be aware of all these little things, and just, I find that that's a really powerful way to stop jealousy, rather than like stamping it on the head and saying like you're wrong for feeling jealous. Yeah. Like, don't shame yourself for feeling jealous. Just be like, I can see what that is. There's other ways I can feel about this. Just look for the other side of it that we might be missing. It's much easier to do that when you imagine the roles reversed. It's much easier to kind of defend ourselves from that kind of attack than to like see yourself doing it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I have to say on the matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we covered it pretty well.
You guys feeling inspired?
Yeah.
I hope so, but not over-inspired.
No, not too inspired, or jealous, or any of those other things.
It's just so hard.
It's this weird tightrope we're walking here.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Compassion, self-compassion at the end of the day.
Yes.
This stuff's hard.
Yes. Art is difficult, and yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how much opens up when you're kind to yourself.
Cool.
All right. Well, wish you guys well. Hope you do feel inspired, and we will catch you next time.